Now is a good time to introduce myself. So I'm Rachel Murphy. I am the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So I'm based here at Plant Life. As I'll describe as we go through the presentation, it is a partnership project and Plant Life is one of the partners. And we tend to sit on the side of volunteer engagement, participation, training. So that's me. This session was set up today by Becky at the National Trust. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about why as we go through the presentation. But welcome. Thank you very much for joining, especially anybody who is new to the scheme or you're interested in becoming a volunteer with us. For anybody that's joined since I've said it, please do feel free to use the chat box, introduce yourselves, give any comments, any questions. Similarly, you can ask questions in the Q&A box. And that's really the added bonus of these live sessions. There's a chance to grab me while I'm here and ask any questions that you might have about the scheme and about how to get involved. But as I say, I am more than happy to provide to Becky to circulate a PDF version of this presentation. That's not a problem at all. And you may well have noticed as you signed on a little notification saying that the session is being recorded. So if anybody wants to watch this at a later time, I'm sure that can be circulated as well. Just a final little bit of housekeeping is that although I can't see or hear you, because it is being recorded, and if you do insert anything in chat or Q&A boxes, that is still visible to everybody within the call, along with, of course, the name that you logged in with. So it's now 12:05, and if anybody wants to join as we're going along, that's absolutely fine, but I'm going to make a start. So just to give you a bit of an outline really of what we're hoping to cover today, I plan to give you a bit of background about the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, or NPMS, as I'm actually going to call it as we go along. It's a little bit less of a mouthful. Basically why it started, what the purpose is, what our aims are. And then I'll introduce essentially any overlaps with National Trust. So how our survey areas overlap with National Trust boundaries and our ambition to improve survey coverage in these areas. And then I'll cover how you get started as a volunteer if you're not already registered with us, and leading on to a bit more detailed just information about planning surveys and actually conducting surveys in the field. I'll also detail any information at the end around where you can get support, what additional resources are out there, how you can gain support from us, how you can gain help or training. So to kick us off really, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, as the name suggests, is a UK-wide scheme. It is citizen science. It's a habitat-based plant monitoring scheme. So that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. And really the scheme provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time. And it really helps us to gain a better understanding of the health of our habitats. So it was designed essentially to meet the need for a really standardised and robust approach to plant monitoring, which was identified as really high priority within the terrestrial biodiversity surveillance strategy. That was published by the JNCC in 2008. And really the basis of NPMS, so if we're going to pop it into a nutshell, is that across the UK, monads we call them, or simply put, 1 kilometre squares, have been randomly designated, and volunteers up and down the country can allocate themselves one or more, however many they'd like to allocate themselves really, squares to survey twice a year. So that's, as I say, that's a real nutshell description of the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. It was designed and developed by the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the JNCC and Plant Life. So JNCC, for anybody that's not as familiar, it's basically the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on UK-wide as well as international nature conservation. The UKCH is an independent not-for-profit research institute and they carry out environmental science across land, sea and air. The BSBI is a botanical society for anyone really interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland. So you may have heard of or even seen the recent publication of the BSBI's latest Plant Atlas 2020. If you are interested in flora, I would highly recommend it, and it's an absolutely excellent resource. It's about, I mean, it's proper doorstop. It's a very big body of work, but happily it is digitized, so you can have a look at Plant Atlas 2020 online. It's a brilliant resource, how species are faring and distribution. And in more recent years, we've been supported by DAERA actually with the scheme's expansion to Northern Ireland. So along with these partners, the scheme was also co-developed with volunteers on the ground during quite an inclusive trial phase. And so that had contributions with volunteers from a variety of backgrounds, experiences, confidence levels, because it's really important really that the scheme is accessible and inclusive, and anybody can get involved, but while also maintaining a real robust and standardized methodology and data standards. So the NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats and through time. So in the UK, there are long-standing schemes for monitoring populations of bats, birds and butterflies. So for example, we have the British Bird Survey and the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But actually until the NPMS began, there wasn't a similar scheme for plants. So of course, with major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, whether through climate change, perhaps nutrient enrichment, management changes, it was really crucial, I was going to say important, but crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations. There was, and there still is, a need for a large scale coverage and a really systematic approach. Otherwise, of course, there's the potential to miss any trends or patterns. So the 4 original partners that I mentioned came together in around 2012 to really devise the scheme and start thinking about the methodologies and how this was going to work. And then a pilot was run with some volunteers in 2014. And then in 2015, the scheme was launched sort of proper, as it were. And that actually makes this season, what's that, the 9th year the scheme has run and data has been collected. And actually the last couple of years have been really pivotal for the scheme because we now have enough data to start actually really looking at trends and indicators. It's always one of those sort of slightly frustrating things of long-term monitoring schemes. In the first few years, of course, we really need to start building up that baseline of data, start building up information before we can start reporting on it. But actually, happily now we are starting to see stories emerge and trends and indicators emerge from the data. Monitoring the NPMS habitat plots twice a year and every year, of course, provides an unparalleled opportunity really to track and understand the responses of plants to changing environment and changing pressures. And it really allows us to investigate how these different pressures are having an impact. As I say, I think it was following our 5th year. Yes, I can see on my slide here, it was around the 5th year or field season, I should say, of surveys, we really started to see these stories emerge. And if you've not seen the report, Understanding the Health of Our Habitats, you can read that report and find out a bit more about the different partners we work with. And that's on the conservation and research page of our NPMS website. So that's one sort of reference I generally recommend. And then another major achievement actually for the NPMS is the experimental indicator. So towards the end of 2020, the DEFRA and JNCC UK biodiversity indicators were published, and these really provide an annual view of how a variety of different groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity have fared across the UK in recent years. And 2020 was a really landmark year for NPMS volunteers because it marked the first ever contribution of NPMS data to a national biodiversity indicator. So that was very exciting for us, and actually just a really clear demonstration of the huge value of the data that our volunteers were collecting. So specifically for, I can see here on this slide, specifically NPMS data for 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats that you can see has been used to create a new indicator for category C7, and that's called plants of the wider countryside. The indicator is still classified as an experimental indicator, and work on this is ongoing, namely because we are still, as a long-term monitoring scheme, we are still relatively young, and we are still continuously making improvements to our analysis as we get more data, of course. But just getting to that point in 5 or 6 years of field surveys really highlights the incredible dedication of NPMS volunteers, as I say, getting out and surveying their patches and helping us to understand these changes in our environment. And there's such a huge potential for future analysis to show changes in plant communities over time. It's getting very exciting within the scheme. We also have reviewed and actually recently accepted an analysis that will be published later this year, I think probably only in about a month's time now, working with NPMS surveys data and also Met Office climate records, investigating which UK habitats are the most and the least exposed to anticipated climate change. Of course, I'm not allowed to say too much because all these things are very embargoed, but it's a really interesting read, really interesting findings coming out of which of our habitats are going to see the greatest exposure to climate change and potentially be impacted more. We're also investigating how effectively the NPMS and other ecological monitoring schemes actually cover these gradients of climate change. As the UK's ecosystems respond to these disruptions, we of course want to be able to keep track of what's happening. But of course, climate change isn't just a future concern. The natural world's already experienced a century or so of rapid changes. But you can find out a bit more about this and the other work that's ongoing within the National Plant Monitoring Scheme in our annual reports. Again, they're on the conservation and research page of our website, as well as other areas that the data has been applied to. NPMS data is provided on the National Biodiversity Network. So there are a number of different projects and analysis underway that utilise NPMS data. So thinking about sort of how we're doing so far and our current coverage nationwide, you can see here a map of all of our NPMS squares. These are absolutely all of our squares, and they're either orange, which means that they're already allocated to a volunteer, or they are blue, which means they're still currently available and sat in wait of somebody keen to take them up. So we currently have around 1,000 and I think about 1,500 volunteers allocated to square, and of course some volunteers take up more than one square. You might have seen a map similar to this one on the website if you've gone and had a little look at the NPMS website, and I have popped a link to that in the chat box as well in case you want to have a little look where your local squares are. As you can see, there are still plenty of blue ones just waiting for a volunteer to take them up. So do have a look to see if there's one near you, and in fact there's even more blue ones currently, as we've just had a release of squares. Something that is worth mentioning at this point as well, actually, is that if you have gone to have a little look for a square, only to find that those near you are orange, meaning that they're already allocated, please don't discount them. Squares are released fairly frequently by volunteers leaving the scheme, or perhaps they've moved geographically and they've taken up another square elsewhere. But sometimes volunteers are also absolutely thrilled by the idea of sharing a square or receiving support from others in the area, including knowledgeable rangers and staff and volunteers of the National Trust, such as yourselves. So in which case, do contact us if you can see a square near you or overlapping an area that you are really familiar with or you work on, if it already appears to be allocated, because we are more than happy to help with any options or link-ups. And thinking a little bit more about our overlaps with the National Trust properties, of course, that's what we're sort of most interested in today, and how these squares relate to National Trust land. Indeed, National Trust boundaries is actually one of the layers on our NPMS map on the NPMS website, which I've just shown here. And we can take a look at which of our designated NPMS survey squares overlap with trust properties, either entirely or even just a portion of the square, in fact. And we can see which of the overlapping squares are already allocated, in which case they're shown orange as they are here, or perhaps they're overlapping but they are still currently without a volunteer, and so surveys aren't currently underway and they are shown in blue. So our first figure here just shows all of the NPMS squares that we have in England, Wales and Northern Ireland that overlap with National Trust boundaries. There's actually, I believe, 108 squares altogether. So it's no small number, and of these, the yellow squares here show those that are allocated. So they already currently have a volunteer or a member of staff allocated to those, and they make up, I think, 65 squares. Yep, I can see, which is about 60% of all of our overlapping squares. And they're currently around 40, still awaiting allocation to a keen surveyor. Now, the next map is slightly different. This isn't showing us allocation versus available. This is showing us which of the squares actually have data submitted. So we hold data on these squares. So again, these are all squares that are overlapping National Trust boundaries. The green squares are those which have data. So we actually have more, we have data for more squares than we have currently allocated. And that's because, as I say, they can become released if a volunteer has been surveying that square, but then they move perhaps, or they start surveying a different square instead. So we currently have data for around 65 of these squares. That could be just 1 year's worth of data. It might be 5 years worth of data. Perhaps somebody's even been doing it since the schemes began, and we have 8 years worth of data. And those red squares are the squares for which we don't have. So we still have nearly 35, I'm trying to do quick maths now, 33 squares that we're yet to have data submitted. So if you do take a look on the map of the NPMS squares on our website and find that there is a square overlapping a National Trust property that you work with or near you, please do consider taking it on or getting in touch if you can see someone else has. So I've been working with Becky and other members of National Trust in recent years to really make sure that we're keeping track of how we're doing, how many people are allocated to squares on National Trust properties, how many people are actually actively surveying, because there's actually quite a big ambition. When I ask, okay, what is the ambition for National Trust? Becky replied, well, we'd like 100% of the squares allocated being surveys. But I suppose we could say, of course, we're always going to say 100%, but I suppose we could say as absolutely many as possible being surveyed would be fantastic. If we have more data coming in, then this creates a more robust data set to compare to the wider countryside. So I know the National Trust are really interested to get this information by using NPMS survey methodology. Our aim is to have staff and volunteers engaged with wildlife volunteering at all the outdoor portfolios, I believe, and NPMS contributes to this, of course. So even for sites that are already allocated to volunteers, just having the support of a local National Trust ranger or staff or volunteer, or even just those people being familiar with the scheme and the volunteers' aims really goes a long way to increasing survey completion and ultimately data collection. So as I say, please do let us know if there are any of these squares near you, overlapping your area, whether it is or isn't allocated. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. And as with all monitoring schemes, one of our main challenges, this is a really common problem, is that we really struggle to get surveys data and even allocation in areas that are perhaps upland squares in more remote locations. So really getting in touch with locals in the area, members of staff, members of the team are really, really helpful. So to revisit super quickly before I move on, the aim of the scheme is to provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within semi-natural habitats, and to use both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. So the species included in the scheme, so we don't ask people to record absolutely all species that they see, but we have a set of species, and they were really chosen to be reliable indicators of habitat health, whether that's, as I say, a positive indicator or a negative indicator species. But they're also species that are widespread and relatively easy to identify. They're quite well-known species. Survey design really needed to be straightforward, repeatable, and achievable by volunteers. So to look a little bit more into the basics, once a surveyor has allocated themselves a randomly designated 1 kilometre square, they are to establish 5 plots. Ideally 3 square plots and 2 linear plots, but it's not set in stone. It really depends what you have on the ground there. Plots should represent different NPMS habitats if possible. And surveyors should record the abundance of these indicator species and any other plot characteristics during their survey. And this is carried out twice a year, once in late spring, early summer. So we have a number of volunteers out at the moment this month going out and conducting their first surveys. And then we have another survey in late summer. So I'm just going to pause just for a second to have a little look at the chat box or Q&A. If there's any questions on that first, please do pop them in now. Okay, none so far. Also a little disclaimer, sorry, I have got getting a really bad cold, but we're powering through, but apologies. Okay. So once a volunteer has registered with the scheme, so they found a square near them, they've registered with the scheme and they've requested a square to be allocated to themselves. They then receive a welcome pack with survey guidance notes, a species ID guide, species and habitat lists, and also survey forms, and of course a map of their 1 kilometre square. So the ID guidebook at the front there, that blue book you can see, was specifically created for the scheme. It's nice and compact and concise, so handy to pop in your backpack when you head out. And it's very niftily organised into flower colour and only contains the key indicator species that we record. Of course, volunteers can and do supplement with their own ID books of choice. The survey guidance notes that you can see there, they are really the go-to guide because they explain all the details of the methodology and setting up and how to actually conduct the survey in the field. The species list booklet shows which species are to be recorded for each habitat. So once you've decided which habitat your plot falls within, there is a set list of species that we ask you to record within that habitat. And that list really depends on the surveyor level that you choose to monitor at, which I will describe in a bit more detail as we go through. You can also see the recording forms just tucked behind there, which once they're used in the field, they're used for uploading the data onto the website. But it is worth saying as well, we do also have quite a nifty app that's free to download to mobiles that can be used directly in the field to record the data. We also email each new volunteer a digital survey pack, so they'll always have a digital copy and all the materials are always available for download from the NPMS website. When you first receive your survey pack and your map, we always recommend a recce visit to identify the NPMS habitats within the square and potentially establish where those plots should be. We check within the square details on the website if there aren't any previously allocated plots in your square. For example, if somebody was previously surveying it and now they've released it. And when that is the case, we do ask that these are adopted where at all possible, rather than creating new plots. And as I say, we are monitoring change over time. So ideally, we want to be recording on the same plots. But of course, that isn't always possible. We just say, if it is possible, to please do that. Using initially footpaths or lanes and using an OS map or phone apps, you can start to really get a picture of what your square is like. And hopefully, if this is in a National Trust property that you are already familiar with, you'll already know it fairly well. But of course, we can use a combination of other tools, OS maps, phone apps, to start getting a picture of what your square is like, who might be managing different parts of it, perhaps, if you have tenant farmers or have different properties on within that square. Perhaps does it overlap with any protected sites that you work with? What's access like, and both in terms of being able to access, but also safety. As I said, where is the NPMS habitat and where does it extend to? This is also a good time to also locate any existing plots, as I say, that may have been created previously by a previous volunteer. It's really worth spending the time to get really familiar. I think it'd be quite easy to put your survey pack together and head out and think, I know where I'm going, but actually it's worth spending a day or so just really making those decisions about where you're going to put your plots, what the habitats are, so what species lists you're going to be using, because then it's a lot easier to work through the survey once you've spent that time. Access to survey sites is another aspect that we tell volunteers they need to consider. And thinking about landowner permissions. It's one of our most common queries. This is volunteer responsibility, but hopefully as I'm talking to people within the National Trust today, you may have a good idea of who you may need to ask permissions from to access certain areas, to set up plots. But we've got a whole raft of advice on our NPMS website as to how to do that, looking at different tools, your Google Maps, local businesses and whatnot. But also we do provide in our resources page an NPMS permissions letter or a postcard, and that really helps to set out why you're asking to access these sites, what you'll be doing. It comes from us within the partnership, and you simply enter your details, the location and contact details for yourself. We always say, remind folk to say thank you, and also to keep landowners informed of any time or tenants or when you're planning to go. And the main points to consider really when thinking about plots are that we really suggest that you aim for 3 square, so 5 by 5 metre plots and 2 linear 1 by 25 metre plots. So we're not asking you to survey the whole 1 kilometre square, because I think by the time you'd be finished, you'd be starting again. So just 5 smaller plots within your 1 kilometre square. There are pre-selected sort of recommended plot locations on the maps that we provide, and we ask that you do look at those if possible first, basically to avoid site selection bias. And I'll come on to those pre-selected plots a little bit further along, I think in a couple of slides. Survey should only be carried out in NPMS semi-natural habitats, and ideally each plot should really be located in a different habitat. But we know that this is really difficult if, for example, your square is made up primarily by heathland and you don't have, many different habitat types. That's absolutely fine. You work with what you have on your square. So just to give a brief overview of how 5 survey plots are selected within the monads, square maps provided to each allocated volunteer look something a bit like this that you can see on the screen now. There are pre-selected numbered plot locations within that square, but the 1 kilometre grid square is selected with a bias towards those with NPMS habitats, even though we do have these sort of more randomised numbered plot suggestions. If possible, it's recommended that you do use these numbered plot locations where you can, basically because I'm sure, as you can imagine, if we're always able to choose our exact plot locations, we may very well end up choosing the rather nice patch of orchids in the corner of the grassland. And as lovely as this would be, of course, if it was scaled up nationally, it would give a bit of a misrepresentation of what's actually happening in our habitats. So we do ask that you try to aim for those numbered plot locations first to try and remove some of that selection bias. If your plot is considered, perhaps, dare I say it, not particularly interesting or not particularly exciting when you're going to visit, we understand it can be a bit frustrating. But actually these plots and in fact absence data is vitally important. It's so important that we also know when things aren't present as well as when they are. So this map here just shows an example. So we would be looking to aim in the first instance during our recce for some of these numbered plots to see if they were suitable, appropriate, accessible. They do fall within a habitat type. If you can find plots within those, that's absolutely perfect. But there is an option if they aren't suitable, which can be the case. It might be a case if you haven't got permission to access, they don't fall within an NPMS habitat type. There is something called Protocol A, which is essentially, it's got a very fancy name for, you can select your own plot locations if necessary. That's absolutely fine. So to provide a quick overview of how we actually set up our plots in the field, whilst on site, we recommend that you use fixed landmarks if possible to record the plot location and set up only temporary markers. We do say please leave nothing behind. You can then record GPS locations, particularly in the southwest corner. And, we're not expecting everybody to have a GPS device, a handheld device. Most of our volunteers will use their mobile phones, perhaps using OS Locate, free app, or even Google. We do ask that you make a plot sketch of your plot and a written description. And that sounds a little bit old-fashioned, especially when we can just take a photograph. But actually we find that when you sit or stand and really consider the surroundings and the position of your plot within that environment, within that landscape, it just makes you consider a few different things, perhaps spot some things that maybe you wouldn't have noticed beforehand, and just view the plot in a different way. And ultimately, we're suggesting you use a number of these different techniques. So GPS, sketches, photographs from the same angle, written descriptions, because it all really helps you to find that plot again in your next visit. It's one of those things you might think, well, I know where I am. I'm going to be able to find this plot again. I was totally guilty of this last summer. I went back on my second survey and thought, I know where I'm heading to. And I stood in my my damp grassland field thinking, oh, now I feel quite foolish, something that I've been sort of telling our volunteers to do. I didn't do a very thorough job at recording exactly the location of my plot. So lesson learned by me. Here you can see just an example field kit. It's quite a simple field kit. Really speaking, we wanted it to be something that everybody should, have certain bits around the house that they can use, really. Don't need to go and get any fancy equipment. We've got our trusty Weatherwriter clipboard, got some marked bamboo canes. I've used long tent pegs before. I'm sure someone told me on training recently that she uses knitting needles because they're quite pointy and they go into the ground very easily. So really anything that's going to mark out your plot corners. I've also torn up some scrap fabric here on the top to make little flags on them, mainly because I'm pretty clumsy and I trip over things, so that helps prevent that. You can also then use a ball of wool or string, garden twine, thin rope to mark out the boundary or the perimeter around your survey plot. And one handy tip that I recommend is to try pre-measuring the string at 5-meter intervals before, and then you mark that up before you head out into the field. So you can either mark them by, tying knots with beads, or putting a marker at 5-meter, again, piece of material or whatnot at 5 meters. So you measure them out before you've gone out into the field, just to save a little bit of time, but equally you can measure on site as well. Another useful bit of kit that's not in this picture is a 1-meter ruler, which is really handy, both for measuring vegetation height, but also your linear plot widths. So using your little kit, all you want to do is place an initial marker in and measure out the first side of your square with a pre-measured string or your tape measure on the day. The clipboard then, as well as being handy to write your notes on, is used to create that 90-degree angle at each corner, so you don't end up with a survey parallelogram or a parallelogram plot instead of a square. It's then in that southwest corner that you take your photo and get your grid reference and draw your sketch and make your observations. So just to show you what it sort of looks like on the ground, hopefully the short turf in these photos is useful to see it in a little bit more detail. As I say, we recommend that you pop your plot somewhere that's parallel to maybe a fence or a path or a hedge line, if possible, so that the orientation will help you to re-find that same location. And once you've completed this part, you need to record that GPS location so that we can enter that into the website, so we know exactly where to attribute that data when you submit your species data. So we do have a super handy video that my colleague Sarah here created and is on our YouTube channel, Don't Lose the Plot Over Plots, and that actually shows her doing it in the field, so you can sort of see it in person, how it looks as somebody is setting up a plot in the field. Most linear plots, however, not like these square plots, but most of them will be 1 by 25 meters. And we use those mostly for arable field margins, standing and running water, rock outcrops and screes, perhaps road verges, and definitely for hedgerows. So really linear features. And ideally you want these linear plots to cover the part of the feature that intersects with an internal or a boundary grid line on your 1 kilometer square map. It's not essential, but that really helps with relocating the plot location. Your plot should start where the feature intersects that grid line, and then moving away from any direction really from there. We use 2 markers to establish the 1 meter width, and then using a cord or rope or tape measure, mark out that 25 meter length. So there's some sort of specific guidance for how we place our plots along linear features, and that's all in our survey guidance notes. So for example, when we're recording a linear plot and arable field margin, we're actually interested not in that permanent sown strip just outside the crop, but we're actually interested in a metre extending into the cultivated area. Similarly with standing and running water, we're interested 1 metre into the water from the normal water level. Hedgerows, we're interested in 1 metre up from the centre of the hedgerows. That's where we're collecting our information. And as I say, there's specific guidance in our survey guidance notes for each linear plot type. So we have 28 fine NPMS habitats that we record species on, and they're nested within 11 broad categories. We do ask that you identify the fine habitat if at all possible, but if not, you can use the broad habitat category. There is a range of positive and negative indicator species that I've mentioned, and these are selected based on a compromise between their reliability as positive or negative indicators of habitat health, but also how widespread they are and ease of ID. If you have very few indicator species within your plot, the information is still really useful and really important. You may decide that you do want to record other species as well, and that information is still useful. We do have an additional recording form or a place to put that information on our website. So you can record it, whether for your own records or to let us know that those species were seen, and that can contribute to distribution information. It just won't be used to assess change in habitat quality. We only use the indicator species for this. So the habitat descriptions that we have used within the NPMS survey guidance notes have been based in part on the excellent guide to British habitats, which I've just popped the citation for down in the bottom there. It's Britain's Habitats, a guide to the wildlife habitats of Britain and Ireland. So within the survey guidance notes, there's a description and images to help you to identify which habitats your plots fall on. You can also find past webinars and presentations on these habitats, how to identify them, the species within, both on our online learning resources on the NPMS website and also on our YouTube channel. So please do take a look. And you can also look out for more webinars to book onto this season as they come up onto the website. So just because I'm quite conscious of time and we need to get onto taking a little look at our survey methods, I'm just going to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the different habitats surveyed within the NPMS. Of course, your allocated square will only include a few of these, but these are all the habitats that we are particularly interested in. So we have broadleaf woodland, comprising dry deciduous woodland, wet woodland, and the hedgerows of native species. We have native pinewood and juniper scrub. We have arable field margins, as I've mentioned. We have lowland grassland habitats, so dry acid, dry calcareous grasslands, neutral damp, neutral pastures and meadows. We have upland grasslands comprising montane acid grassland, montane calcareous grassland. I think, as I've already mentioned, they are slightly less represented. We have a fewer records of these sorts of habitats within the scheme. We have heathland habitats, so dry heathland and dry montane heathland. We have bog and wet heath, comprising blanket bog, raised bog, and wet heath. We also survey marsh and fen habitats, basically the acidic or base-rich fens, fleshes, mires, and springs. And we also record freshwater habitats, so either nutrient-poor or nutrient-rich lakes and ponds, and then also rivers and streams. We record on rock outcrops, cliffs and screes, either inland rocks or montane rocks and scree. And then we have quite a few fine habitats within the coast broad habitat type. We have salt marsh, sand dunes, vegetated shingle, macae, and maritime cliff tops and slopes. So there's quite a few there within the coast habitat category. So we've got quite a few habitats there that we are interested in, but before our volunteers can head out and start surveying, even once they've picked their plots, they've identified the habitat, they need to really decide which level they wish to survey at. So as we say, we wanted the scheme to be inclusive and accessible to all. So we do have 3 different survey types, but it's worth saying that all the forms and the app, and in fact the methodology, is used in exactly the same way for any of the levels. The main difference is in the species that we record. So at the wildflower level, the species are divided into lists applicable for the habitats, as I say, but there's only around 10 to 15 species per habitat that we ask wildflower level volunteers to record on their plots. At the indicator level, this is essentially an expanded list of species. There's around 408 NPMS indicator species altogether, but of course, once divided into groups applicable for habitats, including some species which are a little bit more challenging to identify, such as more grasses and more sedges, more ferns, for example. There are around 30 species per habitat at the indicator level. And then we have the inventory level, and that's really designed for volunteers who are capable of recording absolutely all vascular plant species that they find in a habitat. So the wildflower level is a relatively simpler level in that there's a reduced list of species per habitat. So if you think, for example, about dry deciduous woodlands, which is one of the fine habitats that I've mentioned, that has 20 species, I believe, that need to be identified at the wildflower level. And they include things like ivy, holly, wild garlic, cleavers, for example. But then at the indicator level, there's an expanded list of species to record. So there are 30 in the dry deciduous woodland example, with the additions of things like wood millet, wood speedwell, wood sedge, for example. And then, as I say, the inventory level is recording all species present within the plot. And you can see how that is shown here in our species list booklet. So this is something you receive when you are allocated a square with us. It's also available on the website. And essentially it's a booklet that is split into each of our broad and fine habitats that we record within the scheme. And for each habitat type is the list of indicator species that we ask recorders to survey for, and they record the abundance of these species. So in this example here, we've got the heathland list, or if you're able to record at the fine habitat scale, we've got a dry heathland example here. So for those volunteers that are recording at the wildflower level, they take a look at that first column there with the WF, so the first column next to the species. And for all those species that have that lovely little wildflower symbol next to the species name, they are the species that we ask our wildflower level recorders to note. We then have the indicator column there, which basically shows that is all species on this list are the indicator species for this fine habitat type. The plus and the minus there in the columns simply denote whether they are positive or negative indicators of habitat health. So it's all species on that list. And then, of course, if you're recording at the inventory level, just throw your species list booklet out the window, really, because we're asking you to record all vascular plant species. The last column to note there is a super handy little column that basically shows you the page number that you can find that species on your list within our dedicated NPMS survey, species ID guide. So you've got the species that you're looking for, and this page, you can find it in the ID guide. We've got a number of different options for ID support. Of course, we're always happy for people to send us pictures. It makes a nice change sometimes looking at emails and spreadsheets to get a nice picture of a plant that we can help identify. But of course, we've got our species ID guide, there are wildflower keys and wildflower guides. We also recommend the the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, BSBI website has got some amazing crib sheets, ID guides and training courses as well. And similarly, the Species Recovery Trust. So before we just move on to just taking a quick look over our survey recording forms and the kind of things that we actually ask you to record when you're out on your plots, do let me know if you've got any questions or any notes thus far. Otherwise, that's fine. I can keep going happily. Okay, so looking at the survey recording forms that we actually use in the field. These are really quite straightforward recording forms. We have one form per plot, and we use that same form for our 2 visits, for our first visit in the year in late spring, early summer, and again in our later summer survey. and they're just two sides, as you'll see. So we have what you'd expect to have right at the top of your survey recording form. You've got your name and the date of your first survey, and then the date of your second survey, your square grid reference, the survey level that you're recording at, and your habitat type. We also have a few environmental characteristics there. So whether it's on a slope, how steep is that slope, what direction is that slope? And then we've got some information that can change a bit more between visits. So there's a management type that you can note down, perhaps something that's obvious to you on the ground. You can see that there's been coppicing, there's been cutting, there's been hedge cutting, perhaps there's been active grazing, for example. You can note down any management type. It might be something that's not that obvious, but perhaps the landowner or the tenant has let you know about before when you've sought permission. But you can note down any management type at all. That's really helpful. And we also have grazing. So how intensively that area might be grazed, whether low, medium or high. So they're quite large categories. And you've got two boxes there, as you have in other areas of the form, one for your first visit and one for your second visit. You can also note which animals graze, if known. Do you know there've been sheep in there, cows in there perhaps, or perhaps you can spot some rabbit droppings. That's a bit of a giveaway. And we ask how wooded the plot is, whether dense, scattered, whether it's a hedgerow or there's no trees or shrubs. We then ask you to record vegetation height in categories. So essentially what proportion of your plot falls within different height categories. And I can go through that a little bit more as we go. We have your space for your sketch map or any written description or notes that you can pop in on each visit right at the top, a nice big gap there to put that information in. And then last thing, we have our area to put in the species that we are recording and a score of abundance in your first visit. So you've got the one column there for your first visit and again your second visit. And we do that using the Domin scale. So for anybody not familiar with the Domin scale, I am going to go through that a little bit as well. So that's really it for the recording forms. And the recording forms online completely replicate these. So you can essentially copy what you've written on the recording form directly to the website. So using the relevant species list for the levels and the habitat that you're recording in, you search your plot and you see what species are present, perhaps start in the corner and gradually move out to the rest of the square. You remember to try not to trample the plants too much. Regarding scoring the abundance of species using the Domin scale, I know this can sound a little bit daunting if you haven't used it before. Perhaps if you'd like to just pop a yes or a no within the chat box, let me know, yes, you've used Domin scale before, or no, you haven't. Perhaps you haven't even heard of it. Simply put, it's a way of estimating the amount of ground each species takes up as a percentage of the total area of the plot. So when assigning that species a Domin score, according to the percentage coverage. For example, if there's less than 1% of the square, and in fact only one or two individuals that you can see within your plot, you give it a score of 1. If it is less than 1%, but actually there's several individuals, you give it a score of 2. If you think it's somewhere between 1 and 4% of your plot is covered by that species, you give it a score of 3, and so on. We say that if species are quite scattered throughout your plot, just try to imagine them sort of clustered in a corner. It takes a little bit of imagination, but it's certainly something you get used to. A really great tip is to take with you as part of your kit a 50 by 50 centimetres square, because that represents 1% of the plot. This could be a clear piece of acetate or plastic sheet cut to size. I met a volunteer recently who cut out essentially a frame out of material so that it's at the right size, but it packs nice and small. It folds down nice and small in a backpack. And that's a really great frame of reference. She gets it out, she looks at this 50 by 50 and she gets her eye in and she gets an idea of what constitutes 1% of that plot. It's worth saying, don't forget the leaves. We're not just looking for flowers, and to remember to look beneath larger plants in case there are some hiding underneath. Of course, plants grow in layers. So I just have an example here. Just to break it down slightly. As you can imagine, this part can be slightly subjective, but as long as you're really consistent across all of your survey sites, then try not to worry if your version of 5% is more like someone else's 10%. However, as you can see, each score is within a range of percentages, allowing for some variability. So I've used this image here of a lovely meadow as if it's your square plot and you're looking down at it. Of course, I appreciate this is not perfect for this example actually, and I've got on my to-do list to get a much better picture looking directly down at a plot. Is this one's at a bit of an angle, so no worries at all if your estimates here would differ to what we have. It's more that I wanted to demonstrate here allocating percentages, a score essentially. So if you imagine that all the rough hawk bits, so that's the yellow ones here, we're all squished together in a corner, but remembering to include leaves, not just the flowers, then you can estimate what percentage of the square that would take up. So we've popped in here 35%. We've looked along our score chart at the top there, and we've given it a score of 7. Similarly for Oxeye Daisy, we've gone through the same process again. We've said we think it's about 10% of our plot is taken up by Oxeye Daisies, so we've given that a score of 4, and so on. Done it with Salad Bonnet. There's little sort of pinky green, sort of raspberry looking ones there down the bottom. And our fairy flax, you can just about see dotted, the little white ones dotted about. We think there's around 4% of the square has fairy flax or covered with fairy flax, and so we gave it a score of 3. So that's a really sort of quick guide to the Domin scale, which, as I say, sounds daunting if you're just told, please can you record the Domin scale if you've never heard of it before. But as I say, it's essentially a way of estimating percentage coverage within that plot and assigning it a score. Now, remember, you don't have to get to 100% altogether, as we almost naturally try to do when we're using percentages. We like them to add up to 100%, but that's very unlikely to be the case. Firstly, because there's quite likely to be areas of bare ground in some plots, perhaps some rocks, but also the species are not all present in one plane. They're at different levels of structure and height, so they might be overlapping species. There may well be species in your plot that aren't on your species list, taking up some of that space, and vice versa. So we're not trying to aim to get to 100%. It can take a little bit of a while to get used to and building confidence that you're popping down a correct estimate, or a close estimate, but it's something that you just get quicker at and more confident at with time. And as I say, those categories are rather broad categories that we assign them a score with. So I've already mentioned, as we were looking through the recording form, we ask you to record the slope aspect and how steep it is, again in categories, a management description, information about grazing and how wooded it is, and we're also interested in vegetation height. So essentially, again, what proportion of the vegetation within your square is less than 10 centimetres, is between 11 and 30 centimetres, 30 to 100, and so on. And again, we use a scale. So 1 is less than 1/3, 2 is 1 to 2/3 of your square, and 3 more than 2/3 of the area. So quite nice, simple categories. And just in the same way as we record Domin scale for the species that we're recording, we do also ask that our volunteers record a Domin scale for bare soil, rock, gravel, litter. And by that, I don't mean crisp packets or anything's left behind by visitors, but rather leaf litter, dead stems, logs and whatnot. Also mosses and lichens. So that's it as far as the recording forms go. So do let me know if you've got any questions regarding what is recorded and how. But I've just popped here a nice list of what we really need to be packing in our survey pack. Of course, we've got all of our guidance notes and our lists and our clipboards and pencils, and the plot marking kit that I mentioned earlier. We also say a hand lens can be super useful. We're not expected to get one, but it can be really useful, particularly with ID. Compass is a great idea, a GPS device or your phone, and a camera. And also, of course, consider health and safety. It's a really good idea to pack a first aid kit. And actually, safety is obviously particularly important because we want you to be safe above all else. So please don't survey large bodies of water alone, for example, if possible. And obviously don't try to get in to see that plant that's just out of reach that you just want to identify. Even if you've got absolutely brilliant wellies on, don't do so. Wherever you're going, make sure someone knows where you are, how long you're expected to take, maybe where your car is parked and so on. Just really consider your safety. Take all the food, drink, clothing that you're going to require. Have a phone, as I say. Have a strategy with somebody in place, perhaps if you don't return at the time it's expected, somebody they can call, what to do, where to look, or who to call, perhaps what emergency services to call. It's always a good idea to have a foolproof sort of first aid plan, an emergency plan. So of course, if you spent time going out, setting up your plots and recording the surveys, it's really important to submit your data at the end of it all and really make the most of that extremely valuable time that you've put in and that absolutely great information that you've gathered. So after carrying out your surveys, it's of course absolutely vital that you let us know about it by entering that data. We've got a lot of help on our website for data entry with step-by-step guides. We also have YouTube videos, and there's also a specific webinar for data entry coming up later in the season. So you can register for that as and when if interested and if it would be useful for you. But as I say, you can either enter the data directly to the website via essentially copying those recording forms into the online version of the recording forms, either wildflower, indicator or inventory. And the other option is to use our handy app, the NPMS app. And if you're concerned at all about phone signal, or you think phone signal's too poor in your area or the area that you are recording, that's not a problem because the app is set up to work offline if needed, and then it sends the data when signal is regained. So just to show you really what happens with the data and how incredibly important it is, it helps us to detect national trends, annual trends in species and groups of species. It helps us to monitor the impact of perhaps physical events or severe weather events, such as drought years, for example, flooding. It helps us to monitor the impact of changes in land management, and it links with other species groups, such as pollinators. So we ask that all volunteers enter their data by the end of the 31st of October, really so that we can use it in our overwinter analysis and to contribute to that year's indicator analysis. But there's not a hard deadline in that we'll never stop anybody entering data that hasn't been entered yet. That data goes to within the NPMS database and then onto the National Biodiversity Network. And as I say, it contributes to a lot actually in terms of indicator analysis, looking at species distribution information, plant community information. It links to the BSBI database and the Biological Records Centre. There's loads of different ways our volunteers can gain support. They can find support all through the website, whether via our resources, getting survey packs, crib sheets. We also have training and events pages. So we have online training pages with resources from crib sheets, species lists, species ID lists, past presentations. And we also have live training, so online webinar training, online interactive workshop training. We have one coming up soon, actually, an interactive workshop looking at fern identification, using botanical keys for identifying grasses, for example. So they can be held online, but we do also have in-person training events as well across the country. I'm actually heading to Sheffield Park Garden National Trust site at the end of June to do some in-field training with some volunteers. So you can see any free training opportunities on the NPMS website. We have a lot of training guidance videos as well on our NPMS YouTube channel. They're super popular. They could be on specific species or habitats, or more generally on field skills and survey methodologies. We also have a lovely network of volunteer mentors around the UK. We've got a couple of gaps at the moment. We're hoping to get them filled this year. Basically a nice local support and person that you can go and have a chat to about your surveys. We also have myself and another member of the NPMS support team, Karen, who are always happy to pick up the phone or emails if you have any queries about getting involved, setting up plots, recording your data, what habitat type is, we are more than happy to help. And as you say, support is really key for our volunteers to make them feel part of the volunteer community, make them feel valued. So as well, even if you perhaps don't take on a square yourself, you are most welcome to inquire about buddying up or offering support to volunteers near you. And that's really all I have to say today, because I was really aware that I didn't want to take up too much of your time. And of course, it is lunchtime. So if you do have any questions, do let me know now before I go. But similarly, you can get in touch on support@npms.org.uk and I can answer any questions at all. I hope to see some names pinging up in our allocated square requests. I've had quite a few square requests with National Trust email addresses lately, which is super exciting to see. So it'd be great to see some more, or to get some National Trust volunteers involved as well. We'd absolutely love to see it. So thank you ever so much for sitting through. I hope we've inspired you to take on a square near you. You are more than welcome. Thank you. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.